I trusted my son with my future, and he tried to take my home instead. I walked into court thinking I was invisible, already judged. My son sat there confident, rehearsed, smiling. Then the judge asked one simple question. The room went silent, and in that silence, everything my son planned collapsed. Before I begin, if you've ever lived through betrayal like this, please leave a comment, and subscribe to Voice of Legends. I never thought I'd be telling a story like this, especially not about my own child. When you raise a son, you don't imagine a day where you'll sit across from him in a courtroom, wondering when the boy you loved turned into a stranger with papers in his hands and calculation in his eyes. You imagine scraped knees, graduation days, the first time he drove alone. You imagine holidays, laughter, and maybe arguments that pass with time. You don't imagine learning legal terms like guardianship and incapacity because your own flesh and blood has decided you're no longer fit to own your life. I'm 74 years old. I've lived in the same house for 46 years. That house isn't just wood and nails to me. It's where my husband and I painted the nursery yellow because we didn't want to know the baby's gender. It's where my son took his first steps, gripping the edge of the coffee table. It's where my husband collapsed one winter morning and where I learned what silence truly sounds like after an ambulance leaves. Every crack in the wall has a memory. Every creak in the floor knows my footsteps. After my husband died, the quiet settled in deeper than I expected. Friends checked in at first, neighbors brought casseroles, and my son called more often. That's when I thought, maybe this next chapter wouldn't be so lonely after all. My son, Daniel, started stopping by every weekend. He fixed the loose railing on the porch, replaced a flickering light, brought groceries without asking. He'd sit at my kitchen table drinking coffee like he used to when he was younger and say things like, "Mom, I worry about you being alone," or "You shouldn't have to handle everything yourself." Those words felt like care. They felt like love. I had a small stroke the year after my husband passed. It was mild, they said. I walked out of the hospital on my own feet. But it scared me. It scared Daniel more, or so I thought. He insisted on driving me to appointments. He asked to help with my bills, just to organize things. I hesitated at first, but when your child offers help, you don't immediately assume danger. You assume kindness. You assume you raised them right. I didn't notice when concern became control. I didn't notice when suggestions became instructions. I didn't notice when he started answering questions for me at doctor visits until the nurse looked at me instead of him and waited for my voice. I noticed that look, but I brushed it away. Families are complicated, I told myself. He's just worried. The letter came on a Tuesday. Plain envelope, my name typed neatly. I assumed it was another medical bill or something from the insurance company. I opened it at the kitchen counter, standing where I've stood 1,000 times before. The words didn't make sense at first. Petition, guardianship, incapacitated, court date. I read it again and again. My hands started shaking so badly I had to sit down. My son had filed paperwork asking the court to declare me legally incapable of managing my own affairs. He claimed I was confused, forgetful, vulnerable. He requested full guardianship, medical, financial, residential, control over my home, control over my house. I remember whispering his name out loud, as if saying it softly might explain everything. Daniel. My voice sounded small in that kitchen. I felt like I was shrinking, folding in on myself, becoming the helpless person the papers described. But I wasn't helpless. I paid my bills. I cooked my meals. I knew exactly where I was and what I owned. I called him immediately. He didn't answer. I left a message I barely remember, something between a question and a plea. He called back hours later, calm as ever. He said it was just a precaution, that the lawyer suggested it, that it would protect me, that I shouldn't be upset. He told me the court process was routine, nothing to worry about. He spoke like he was explaining something simple to a child. That hurt more than the paperwork. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in my living room with the lights off, staring at the shadow of the bookshelf my husband built, thinking about how easily someone could take everything from you if they decided you were no longer worth listening to. I realized then how many elderly people must feel this exact fear quietly without knowing where to turn. The next morning, I called a lawyer. I'd never hired one before. My voice shook as I explained what was happening. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she said, "You're not alone, and you're not powerless." I cried when she said that because I needed to hear it from someone who wasn't trying to own my future. The weeks leading up to the hearing were heavy. Daniel stopped visiting. When he did call, it was brief and formal. He spoke through his attorney more than he spoke to me. I learned he had already prepared a plan for my finances, for my house, for where I would live if the guardianship was granted. Assisted living, he said, for my safety. He never asked me what I wanted. The day of the hearing, I wore the same navy blue dress I'd worn to my husband's funeral. It felt appropriate, like mourning something else I was about to lose. The courtroom was colder than I expected. Daniel sat at the table with his attorney, papers stacked neatly, posture confident. He barely looked at me. When he did, there was no softness in his eyes, only certainty, like this was already decided. I sat beside my attorney, hands folded in my lap, trying to keep my breathing steady. I reminded myself of the facts. I am here. I am capable. I am not a problem to be solved. When the judge entered, everyone stood. My heart pounded so loudly I was sure the room could hear it. This was it. This was the moment where someone else would decide whether I still belonged to myself. Daniel's lawyer spoke first. He painted a picture of concern and responsibility. He talked about my age, my stroke, my declining ability. He spoke about my house like it was an asset, not a home. Daniel nodded at the right moments, practiced and prepared. I watched him and wondered when he learned to lie so smoothly about someone he once needed for everything. Then my attorney spoke. She talked about my independence, my medical records, my daily routines. She spoke about me like a person, not a problem. I appreciated that more than I can explain. The judge listened quietly. He asked a few clarifying questions. My palms were damp. I couldn't tell what he was thinking. And then, just as I thought we were nearing the end, he leaned forward slightly and looked directly at my son. The room seemed to hold its breath. That's when he asked the question, and everything changed. The judge didn't raise his voice. He didn't sound angry. In fact, his tone was almost gentle, the way someone speaks when they already know the answer but want to see if the truth will be offered willingly. He looked at my son for a long moment before speaking, long enough for the confidence on Daniel's face to flicker just slightly, like a light bulb struggling to stay on. He asked, "Mr. Harris, when was the last time your mother failed to recognize you or did not know where she was?" The question hung in the air. It didn't sound dramatic, it didn't sound complicated, but I felt something shift in my chest like a tight knot loosening just a little. Daniel opened his mouth, then closed it. He glanced at his lawyer, then back at the judge. The courtroom was quiet enough that I could hear the hum of the lights above us. "Well," Daniel began, and that single word told me everything. He hadn't expected this question. He had prepared for medical jargon, for legal definitions, for arguments about age and risk. He hadn't prepared for something so simple, something so human. "Well," he said again, clearing his throat, "there have been moments where my mother seemed confused." The judge tilted his head slightly. "Confused how?" Daniel's face flushed. "She forgets small things, appointments, names sometimes." I felt a sharp sting of anger then, not because it was entirely untrue, but because it was exaggerated, stretched thin to fit a narrative that benefited him. I forget names sometimes, so does everyone I know. I forget appointments the same way people half my age do, because life is busy and minds wander. But the way he said it made me sound lost, drifting, unreachable. The judge nodded slowly. Can you give me a specific date and incident when your mother did not recognize you as her son? Daniel's hands tightened on the table. I could see it now, the pale color creeping into his face, the confidence draining away. He swallowed hard. I don't recall an exact date. The judge leaned back in his chair. So there has never been a moment where your mother did not know who you were. Daniel hesitated too long. No, he said finally. It came out quieter than everything else he'd said that morning. And has your mother ever been found wandering, unable to return home, or required emergency intervention due to confusion? No, Daniel admitted. The judge turned his gaze to me then, and for the first time since I'd entered that courtroom, I felt truly seen, not as a case, not as a risk, but as a person sitting in front of him. He asked me a few questions directly: my name, my address, the date, who the president was, what medications I took and why. I answered calmly, clearly. My voice didn't shake. Each answer felt like reclaiming a piece of myself that had been quietly taken. Then the judge returned his attention to my son. Mr. Harris, he said, you are requesting full guardianship over your mother, including control of her residence. Can you explain why selling or transferring ownership of her home is necessary for her care? Daniel straightened, as if grateful for a question he recognized. The house is old, it requires maintenance. The funds could be used for a safer living arrangement. Has your mother expressed a desire to sell her home? The judge asked. Daniel glanced at me. I met his eyes. For the first time, he looked uncomfortable meeting my gaze. She hasn't been fully receptive to the idea, he said. The judge raised an eyebrow. So she has said no. Daniel didn't answer immediately. Silence stretched again. Yes, he said finally, she has said no. And yet, the judge continued, you are requesting full guardianship over her right to make that decision herself. Something in the room shifted then. I felt it. Even the air felt heavier. Daniel's lawyer shifted in his seat, adjusting his tie. Daniel's face had gone pale now, the color drained completely, leaving behind a strained, almost frightened expression. This was the moment he hadn't planned for. This was the crack in the story. The judge asked one more question, the one I will remember for the rest of my life. Mr. Harris, he said, what is your mother's monthly income, and how are her bills currently being paid? Daniel blinked. I handle most of that now. The judge's eyes sharpened. That was not my question. Daniel stumbled then. He named an amount that wasn't accurate. I knew it wasn't because I balanced my checkbook every month. My attorney gently corrected him, providing statements and records. The judge examined them carefully, his expression unreadable. When he looked back at my son, there was no anger in his face, just disappointment. It appears, it seems, that your mother has managed her finances responsibly and independently. There is no evidence before this court that she is incapacitated. Daniel's shoulders slumped slightly. The posture he'd walked in with, confident and upright, was gone. He looked smaller now, younger, not in a way that inspired sympathy, but in a way that revealed the truth beneath the performance. The judge denied the petition. He did it calmly, methodically, citing reasons and legal standards, but all I heard was the rush of blood in my ears and the pounding of my heart. Denied. The word echoed inside me like a bell. I didn't cry then. I sat very still, absorbing the fact that I was still mine, that my home was still my home, that my voice still mattered. The judge looked at Daniel one last time. Guardianship is a serious matter. It is not a tool for convenience or control. It exists to protect those who truly cannot protect themselves. Daniel nodded, eyes downcast. He didn't look at me again. When the hearing ended, my attorney squeezed my arm gently. "You did well," she whispered. I thanked her, though the words felt inadequate for what she had helped preserve. Outside the courtroom, Daniel approached me. He looked shaken, his confidence completely gone. "Mom," he started, "I was just trying to help." I looked at him then, really looked at him, and felt a sadness deeper than anger. "I didn't ask you what I needed. You decided for me." He didn't respond. There was nothing left to say. I went home that afternoon and sat in my living room, sunlight spilling across the floor just like it always had. The house felt the same, but I didn't. Something inside me had hardened, not in a bitter way, but in a protective one. I understood now how fragile independence can be when others decide you've outlived your right to use it. That night, I locked my doors, balanced my checkbook, and wrote a list of boundaries I would no longer ignore. Love doesn't look like control. Care doesn't arrive in secret paperwork, and dignity, once threatened, must be defended with every steady breath you have left. The days after the hearing were strange. The house felt quieter than it had in decades, not because anyone had left, but because the tension had lifted, replaced with a heavy, cautious relief. I woke up each morning and walked through rooms that were mine, noticing details I had taken for granted. The scratch in the floor where Daniel had once fallen chasing a ball, the small stain on the carpet from my husband's morning coffee, the faded wallpaper I had always meant to repaint but never had the time for. Each memory felt like a small anchor, grounding me in the life I had fought to protect. Daniel didn't visit. He didn't call much either. When he did, it was short, polite, and carefully measured. I could hear the difference in his voice, something I hadn't noticed before the courtroom. It wasn't the warmth of a son checking on his mother. It was a tentative attempt at normalcy after the confrontation, a way to tiptoe around the truth of what he had tried to do. I didn't respond with anger. I couldn't. Anger would have meant giving him more power than he had earned. Instead, I listened politely, offered minimal responses, and then hung up. Boundaries were my new armor. Even though Daniel was keeping his distance, I felt a need to reach out to others, to rebuild a sense of community that had been shaken. I called a neighbor I hadn't spoken to in years, someone who had known my family when Daniel was a boy. We talked for hours, reminiscing about the past and sharing quiet laughter. I realized then that even in betrayal, there was still life outside these walls, still people who valued me for me. I started writing letters to old friends, inviting them over for tea or just to sit and talk. The simple act of connection reminded me that the world hadn't become smaller, even if my trust in one person had. But even as I rebuilt, the memory of that courtroom moment lingered. I replayed it in my head endlessly, over and over. The judge's calm authority, Daniel's pale face, the way the room had gone silent at that one question. I understood something then that I hadn't realized before. Sometimes the truth doesn't need to be loud to be devastating. It doesn't need to scream or argue. It only needs to exist, steady and undeniable, for the facade to crumble. I began to notice little signs that Daniel was still struggling with what had happened. My mail, for instance, was delivered without interruption, yet once or twice I found little receipts or forms that had been carefully removed from the pile and returned, as if someone had been trying to check on my affairs without permission. I didn't confront him. I just adjusted my habits, keeping records, securing documents, and making sure my independence was unassailable. Every action I took was a quiet statement. I am capable. I am present. I am still here. One afternoon, about a month after the hearing, Daniel showed up at the door. He didn't knock, he just waited, standing on the porch with his hands in his pockets. I opened the door slowly, taking in his nervous posture, the way he avoided looking directly at me. "Mom," he said quietly, "can we talk?" I let him in, but I didn't sit down. I stayed standing, leaning against the doorway to the living room. It felt like a gentle assertion of control over my space. He sat on the edge of the sofa, hands clasped tightly together. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. The silence wasn't awkward. It was the space where truth and reconciliation had to pass through, like water through a sieve. I didn't mean to scare you," he began. His voice was small, vulnerable, unlike the rehearsed tone he had used in court. I thought I was helping. I didn't know how else to make sure you'd be okay." I studied him, my chest tightening. "You thought control was care," I said softly. "You thought ownership and paperwork could replace asking me what I needed." He nodded, swallowing hard. "I see that now. I didn't want to see you hurt or alone. I thought I was protecting you." "You were protecting yourself, Daniel," I said. The words surprised me in their clarity. Not me. I was living my life just fine before you decided to rewrite it. He flinched at that, and I could see the guilt pressing down on him like a weight he couldn't lift. "I'm sorry, Mom," he whispered. "I didn't realize. I held up a hand. "Stop. I didn't need apologies. I didn't need excuses. What I needed was acknowledgement and understanding. He had given me neither until the courtroom, and now he was trying to patch a wound he had inflicted. "I know you're sorry," I said, "and that matters. But understand this. Love doesn't force decisions. Care doesn't take what isn't offered. You cannot protect someone by taking their voice away." He nodded, tears brimming in his eyes. It was strange to see him so small, so human, after years of confidence and control. He had always seemed invincible to me, the son who solved everything, who knew what was best. But now, stripped of his certainty, he looked like the boy who had once needed me to guide him through scraped knees and midnight fears. We talked for hours, not about the guardianship papers, not about the house, not about what could have been taken or lost. We talked about memories, small ones, fleeting ones, and the ones that mattered most. The first time he rode a bike without training wheels, the Christmas where we forgot to buy a tree and made one out of cardboard and tinsel, the summer evening we sat on the porch watching fireflies and talking about dreams he never chased. I realized then that the courtroom had not only been a place of confrontation, it had been a mirror. It had reflected both of us back to ourselves. Me as the person who had fought quietly for her dignity and independence, and him as the person who had tried to assert control out of fear and misplaced care. It didn't erase what he had done, but it gave him a chance to see it too. In the weeks that followed, life began to settle into a cautious rhythm. Daniel and I still spoke, though the dynamic had changed. He no longer tried to manage my life. He asked before acting, and he listened when I answered. It wasn't perfect, and I knew it might never be, but it was real. It was honest. And honesty, I discovered, was the foundation of any relationship, no matter how fractured. I also began to speak more openly about what had happened. I shared my story with a friend's support group for seniors, quietly at first, then more openly as I found my voice. I discovered that I wasn't alone, that there were others who had faced betrayal from those closest to them. Sharing my experience became a form of healing, a way to reclaim not just my home, but my narrative. It reminded me that our stories, even the painful ones, carry power. They carry lessons, warnings, and hope. One evening, I sat by the window watching the sun dip below the horizon. The house was quiet, but alive with memories and resilience. I thought about the judge and that single question that had changed everything. It was such a simple thing, really, but sometimes simplicity holds the greatest power. A single question had cut through years of fear, deception, and control. It reminded me that the truth, steady and undeniable, cannot be hidden forever. I thought about Daniel, too, about the way he had changed slowly through acknowledgement and reflection. I didn't know what the future held for us. I didn't know if our relationship would ever return to the easy warmth it had once had. But I knew one thing: boundaries were set, respect was demanded, and in that, I had found a sense of peace that was worth more than any house, any inheritance, or any attempt at control. That night, I wrote in my journal, as I often did. I wrote about the courtroom, about the fear, the betrayal, and the unexpected vindication. I wrote about lessons learned and strength reclaimed. And I wrote about hope, hope that even in the most painful moments, dignity could survive, that even in the face of betrayal, a person could stand firm and say, "This is my life, and I will live it on my own terms." It wasn't a dramatic ending, not in the way movies portray resolutions. There was no grand reconciliation, no grand forgiveness, just quiet, just a life reclaimed, a voice restored, and a lesson etched into memory. Never underestimate the power of truth, and never let anyone convince you that your life belongs to them. The house was mine, my voice was mine, and for the first time in weeks, I felt completely, undeniably, and irrevocably at home in both. The weeks following the courtroom battle settled into an odd mixture of relief and vigilance. I felt stronger, more present, more awake to the reality of my own life. But strength, I soon realized, comes with its own challenges. When someone close betrays you, it leaves a mark, not a visible scar, but one that lingers in the quiet moments, in the small choices you make, in the ways you protect yourself from future pain. I found myself watching Daniel more carefully, not with suspicion, but with awareness. Every phone call, every suggestion I analyzed. Did he mean well this time, or was it still the same old drive for control masked in concern? I started documenting everything: my daily routines, bills, doctor visits, phone calls, even casual interactions. I felt ridiculous at first, like a paranoid old woman, but it gave me a sense of security. Knowledge is power, as they say, and in my case, it was a shield. I had already lost faith in blind trust. That doesn't mean I stopped trusting him entirely. It just meant I stopped giving him power over my life without earning it. Daniel seemed to understand this unspoken boundary. He didn't push anymore, didn't overstep in ways I noticed. Our interactions became quieter, more cautious, but there was a shift. He listened when I spoke, and he waited for permission before acting. It wasn't love or forgiveness in its ideal form. It was respect. And in the aftermath of betrayal, respect is a rare treasure. One morning, I received a phone call from an old friend, Margaret, who I hadn't spoken to in years. She had heard about the guardianship attempt and wanted to check in on me. Her voice, warm and gentle, carried a familiarity that had been missing from my days lately. We arranged to meet at a small cafe downtown. Sitting across from her, sipping coffee and sharing stories, I realized how isolated I had allowed myself to become in the months leading up to the court case. Fear and uncertainty had created walls around me, and it took someone else's presence to remind me that life still existed beyond my home. Margaret listened to my story without interruption. She didn't offer judgment or quick solutions. She simply nodded, her eyes reflecting empathy and understanding. By the time I left the cafe, I felt lighter. The weight of betrayal still lingered, but it had shifted from a crushing heaviness to a manageable reminder. I was still in control, and I was still me. Life, however, has a way of testing lessons learned. A few weeks later, Daniel called unexpectedly. There was a hesitance in his voice that I hadn't heard before. "Mom," he said softly, "I found some old documents in the attic. They belonged to Dad. I think you should see them." I hesitated, unsure whether to trust this sudden initiative, but curiosity got the better of me. When he arrived, he carried a stack of yellowed papers and old photographs. I recognized them immediately. My husband's handwriting, my son's baby pictures, letters from decades past. As we sat at the kitchen table, he began to explain. "I wasn't planning to go through all of this, but I thought you might want these. They're your memories, Mom. Dad's, too." His voice faltered, and I could see that he was struggling to maintain composure. I felt a mixture of gratitude and unease. Gratitude because these documents were precious, tangible pieces of my family history. Unease because this gesture, though kind, reminded me of how close he had come to taking everything from me. It was a fragile bridge between past betrayal and possible reconciliation, and I had to tread carefully. We spent hours going through the papers, old letters between my husband and me, photographs from family vacations, and even a few letters Daniel had written as a child. Each item was a reminder of life before betrayal, of love that existed in its simplest, purest form. It was painful and comforting at the same time. Daniel spoke little, but when he did, it was with a sincerity I hadn't heard in months. "I never wanted to erase any of this. I didn't know how to handle it all. I was afraid of losing you." I looked at him and felt a complex swirl of emotions: anger, sadness, nostalgia, and surprisingly, a glimmer of hope. "Fear doesn't give anyone the right to take from others," I said gently. "It doesn't excuse trying to control someone's life, but acknowledgement is the first step towards understanding." He nodded, and for the first time I saw a childlike vulnerability in him, the boy who had once held my hand and looked to me for guidance. The years had given him arrogance and confidence, but the courtroom and its lessons had humbled him. I realized then that the experience had changed him, even if slowly, in ways that weren't fully visible yet. Over the next few weeks, we began a careful ritual of rebuilding. We talked, but not just about the past. We spoke about mundane things: the garden, my recipes, the upcoming holidays. He helped me repair a leaky faucet, and I let him, but I made it clear the decisions were mine. I could see him struggling to balance wanting to help with respecting my autonomy. There were moments of tension, but they were short-lived, dissipating quickly because we both understood the rules of engagement now. At night, after he left, I would sit by the window and reflect on the journey. I thought about how easily fear can masquerade as care, and how betrayal can come from the hands you once held as a child. I realized that the guardianship attempt, as devastating as it had been, had also forced me to confront truths I might have otherwise ignored. I had learned to assert boundaries, to value my own judgment, and to recognize the difference between love and control. I also reflected on the judge's role in all of this. That one question, so simple, so human, had shattered the illusion Daniel had built around me. It reminded me of the power of clarity, of observation, and of speaking truths calmly and steadily. The courtroom was a stage, yes, but it had also been a mirror. It revealed not just Daniel's intentions, but the strength I had always carried within myself. One evening, Daniel came over unannounced with a small gift, a framed photograph of my husband and I on our wedding day, smiling at each other under the summer sun. "He found this in the attic," he said softly. "I thought it should be on the wall." I took the frame carefully, feeling the weight of the moment. It was a simple gesture, but loaded with meaning. It wasn't an apology for the guardianship attempt. It wasn't a promise that nothing like it would happen again. But it was a recognition of shared history, of what we had lost, and of what could still be preserved. I placed the photo on the mantel, next to my husband's old clock. The room felt warmer somehow, filled with memories and resilience. Daniel lingered for a few minutes, and we talked about mundane things, the weather, the garden, his work. It was ordinary, but ordinary felt extraordinary after everything that had happened. That night, I reflected on the nature of family and love. I understood that relationships are fragile, especially when trust is broken. But I also understood that honesty, boundaries, and acknowledgement could rebuild bridges, even if imperfectly. Life, I realized, isn't about never being betrayed. It's about how you respond when betrayal comes. It's about reclaiming your voice, your space, and your dignity. As I prepared for bed, I looked around my home. Each room, each object, each memory was mine. I had fought to protect it, and in doing so, I had protected a piece of myself. I had learned that independence isn't just about physical ability or financial control. It's about asserting your right to be heard, respected, and valued as a human being. Daniel's presence in my life had shifted, but I no longer feared it. I had learned that strength isn't about confrontation alone. It's about calm vigilance, patience, and the courage to assert your own worth. I had survived betrayal, and in doing so, I had discovered a deeper understanding of myself, of love, and of the delicate balance between care and control. For the first time in weeks, I slept deeply that night, feeling the quiet comfort of a life reclaimed. I knew there would be challenges ahead, that the path of rebuilding trust is long and winding, but I also knew this: I had faced the betrayal, met it with courage, and emerged intact. And that, I realized, was a victory far greater than any courtroom ruling or legal document could ever grant. Morning sunlight streamed through the kitchen window, hitting the countertop in warm golden squares. I moved slowly, deliberately, carrying my cup of tea to the table where the letters from my husband and old photographs still lay. I had been poring over them every day, not out of obsession, but out of necessity. They reminded me of who I was, who I had loved, and what my life had been before betrayal shook its foundation. Each photograph, each carefully folded letter, was a thread connecting the present to a past that Daniel had almost tried to erase. The phone rang just as I was about to sit down. I hesitated, the weight of the past months pressing on me, before answering. "Hello?" I said, my voice steady but cautious. Daniel's voice came through, soft and hesitant. No rehearsed tone, no arrogance, just him, for once, speaking as the son I had raised. "Good morning, Daniel," I replied carefully. I wanted to come over today. Can I? I brought something." I paused, measuring my response. I wanted to see him, to observe the way he approached, to gauge whether this visit was about connection or control. "All right," I said finally. "Come by around noon." When he arrived, he carried a small wooden box, worn but polished with care. He placed it on the kitchen table without a word and sat across from me. "I found this in the attic," he said quietly. "It belonged to Dad. I thought you might want it." I lifted the lid carefully. Inside were old journals, letters, and photographs, memories from decades past, carefully preserved. I ran my fingers over the edges of the papers, feeling the texture of time. There were notes from my husband, little observations about daily life, anecdotes about Daniel as a child, and letters I had written him when he was away at camp. Each piece was a tangible memory, a reminder of love and life before betrayal had tainted our days. I thought you might like to keep them together," Daniel said, his voice barely above a whisper. I looked at him. He seemed smaller somehow, humbled by what had happened in the courtroom, by the realization of the hurt he had caused. He avoided my gaze, glancing at the papers instead, as if their presence gave him courage. "Thank you, Daniel," I said softly. "These mean a lot, not because of what's inside, but because they remind me that life and love existed before this mess. And they remind me that even now we can choose how to carry it forward." He nodded, still avoiding my eyes, but I could see the weight lifting slightly from his shoulders. It was as if giving these papers to me was a small way of atoning for the guardianship attempt, a tentative step toward reconciliation without erasing what had been done. We spent the next several hours going through the documents together. We laughed quietly at memories long forgotten, the time Daniel tried to build a treehouse in the wrong tree, the night the dog ran off with the Thanksgiving turkey, and the summer vacation when we got lost driving to the lake and ended up camping by the side of the road. Each memory softened the edges of the anger and fear that had accumulated over the past months. Yet beneath the laughter, there was a tension I could not ignore. It wasn't anger exactly, but a subtle awareness of the fragility of our restored connection. Daniel had crossed a line once, and trust once broken is slow to rebuild. I had learned to measure his words, to read between the lines, and to protect my autonomy even while allowing him access to my life. When the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the kitchen floor, Daniel spoke quietly, almost reluctantly. "Mom, I know what I did was wrong. I wasn't thinking clearly. I thought I was helping, but I see now that I wasn't. I took control where I had no right. I held up a hand to stop him. "Daniel, I know you're sorry. I can see it in your eyes, and acknowledging it matters. But words alone don't erase the past. Actions moving forward do. That's how trust is rebuilt." He nodded solemnly, and I could see the effort it took for him to process that truth. He wasn't used to accountability, especially when he thought he was acting in my best interest. But now he was beginning to see that care is not ownership, love is not control, and protection does not come through domination. In the weeks that followed, Daniel began helping me differently. He asked before making decisions, listened when I spoke, and supported me in ways that were genuinely collaborative. We repaired things in the house together, the leaky faucet, a broken window, a patch in the roof. He didn't do it for recognition or to assert power. He did it because I asked, because it was mutual. I also started reconnecting with friends and neighbors more deliberately. I had realized that isolation had made the guardianship attempt possible. Fear thrives in silence. By surrounding myself with people who valued me and my autonomy, I fortified not only my home, but my spirit. I invited friends for tea, shared stories, and offered advice when asked. These small acts reminded me that community, connection, and vigilance are essential for resilience. One afternoon, Daniel brought up a difficult topic. "Mom, I've been thinking about the guardianship, about what I did. I don't expect forgiveness, but I want to understand. Can we talk about why I thought it was necessary?" I paused, considering how to respond. I wanted him to understand the impact of his actions, but I also wanted the conversation to be constructive, not accusatory. "Daniel," I said finally, "you thought you were protecting me because you feared losing me. But protecting someone isn't about taking their rights or their voice. It's about supporting them and making their own choices, even if they make mistakes. That's real care. That's real love." He nodded, absorbing the lesson with a seriousness that surprised me. "I see that now," he said quietly. "It's hard to admit, but I understand that my fear made me blind to your needs. I'll do better. I want to do better." It was a small, tentative step, but a step nonetheless. The path to trust is never straight or easy, but I could see that he was willing to walk it with me, cautiously and respectfully. That evening, as I sat in my living room, I reflected on the journey so far. I thought about the courtroom, the judge, and the single question that exposed the truth. I realized that strength isn't always about confrontation or victory. Sometimes it's about steady presence, awareness, and the courage to assert your own worth in the face of those who would take it from you. I also reflected on Daniel, on the son I had raised and the man he had become. He had made a grave mistake, one that could have taken everything from me. But he had faced consequences, experienced humility, and begun to understand the meaning of respect and autonomy. In a strange way, the ordeal had reshaped him as much as it had reinforced me. I spent the night journaling, recording memories, thoughts, and lessons learned. I wrote about the betrayal, the courtroom, the subtle moments of reckoning, and the fragile beginnings of reconciliation. Writing became a way to process, to assert my narrative, and to remind myself that my life, my choices, my memories, and my home were mine to claim and defend. Over the following months, life regained a quieter rhythm. Daniel and I interacted, but always with a new understanding. Our conversations were measured, respectful, and sometimes painfully honest. There were moments of tension, of missteps, but they were followed by reflection and adjustment. I learned that forgiveness doesn't erase betrayal. It transforms it into understanding, patience, and a cautious but genuine willingness to reconnect. I also took steps to protect myself legally and financially. I updated my will, clarified my accounts, and ensured that all important documents were secure. These were not acts of distrust, but acts of self-respect and preparation. Independence, I realized, isn't just a state of mind, it's also a set of practical measures to ensure that your voice remains your own. The house itself became a sanctuary once again. I tended the garden, repaired creaky floorboards, and sat in my favorite chair by the window watching the seasons change. Each creak of the floor, each ray of sunlight reminded me that this space, my space, was preserved through courage, vigilance, and the quiet assertion of my own agency. Daniel's presence became more natural over time. He helped when I asked, shared memories without judgment, and even began contributing small gestures of care that weren't tied to control or ownership. I didn't feel the same blind trust I had once felt, but I felt respect, and that was enough. The dynamic had shifted. He was no longer a threat, but a son learning to navigate the balance between love and autonomy. I understood now that life isn't about never being hurt or betrayed. It's about how we respond when it happens. It's about reclaiming our voice, asserting our boundaries, and nurturing the relationships we choose to sustain. And most importantly, it's about remembering who we are, even when others try to convince us otherwise. One evening, I placed a new photograph on the mantel, a simple portrait of Daniel and me, taken quietly during a small garden gathering. He smiled genuinely, no pretense, no arrogance, just the son I had raised and the man who had learned, slowly and painfully, that care without consent is not love. I smiled too, feeling the weight of the past lift, replaced by cautious hope and the quiet strength of a life reclaimed. As I turned off the lights and prepared for bed, I reflected on what had happened, on the lessons learned, and on the enduring power of dignity and truth. Betrayal had come from the hands I once held with love, but truth, patience, and courage had remained in my hands. And in that, I realized, lay the real victory. Not in punishment, not in anger, but in the quiet, unwavering assertion of my right to live, decide, and belong to myself. Life after the storm settled into a rhythm I hadn't felt in years. Each day became a quiet affirmation of independence and vigilance. I moved through the house with a newfound awareness, noting small details I had taken for granted before. How the sunlight hit the staircase in the morning, how the wind rattled the old windows just slightly, the faint smell of my husband's old woodworking tools in the garage. Each detail was a reminder. This was my space, my life, and I still belonged here. Daniel began visiting more often, though always with hesitation, always with the subtle deference that came from the memory of the courtroom. He no longer assumed he knew what was best for me. Instead, he asked. He listened. He waited for permission. At first, it felt strange, almost unnatural. I had spent decades raising him, guiding him, correcting him when he overstepped. Yet here he was, finally learning what it meant to respect someone's autonomy. I remember one particular afternoon, early spring, when he arrived with a small bag of seedlings for the garden. "I thought we could plant these together," he said, trying to sound casual. I looked at him, skeptical at first, remembering the way he had once tried to seize control of my life, and then I noticed the way he carried himself, tentatively, with care, not authority. We spent the next hour kneeling in the soil, planting tiny sprouts of marigolds and tomatoes. We talked about mundane things, the weather, the new neighbors, his work. There was no tension, no underlying motive, just quiet companionship. And yet beneath it, I felt the fragile threads of trust beginning to weave themselves back together. Trust doesn't rebuild overnight, I realized. It rebuilds in small moments, in ordinary acts, in patience. The house itself seemed to breathe again. I repaired the cracked windows I had ignored for years, repainted the kitchen cabinets, and even replaced the old carpet in the hallway. Each act was a statement. I was not diminished by fear. I was not diminished by betrayal. I was still here, fully present, and fully capable. Daniel began helping in subtle ways, without taking ownership. He fixed the leaky faucet I had been meaning to repair, but only when I asked. He cleaned gutters, not to claim credit, but simply to assist. He began to understand that real care isn't about control. It's about presence, attentiveness, and consent. Evenings became a time for reflection. I would sit by the window, journal in hand, and write about the day. I wrote about the courtroom, the tension, the fear, and the eventual vindication. I wrote about Daniel, about the way he had faltered and begun to learn, about the slow reconstruction of a relationship fractured by betrayal. Writing became a form of therapy, a way to process complex emotions and assert my narrative. I realized then that reclaiming my voice wasn't just about surviving the guardianship attempt. It was about telling my story clearly, honestly, and without fear. One day, a neighbor named Mrs. Larkin, who had witnessed some of the tension between Daniel and me, stopped by for tea. She had brought cookies, of course, and a gentle smile that immediately made me feel at ease. As we talked, I shared portions of what had happened, the guardianship, the courtroom, the betrayal. I didn't spare the details, but I didn't dwell in bitterness either. I told the story with measured calm, emphasizing the lessons learned rather than the pain endured. Mrs. Larkin listened, nodding thoughtfully. "It's remarkable," she said finally. "How you've handled it. So many people would crumble in your place." I shook my head. "It wasn't easy," I said, sipping my tea. "But I had to remind myself who I am. Independence isn't given, it's maintained. Dignity isn't assumed, it's defended." Her words echoed in my mind long after she left. I realized that part of healing wasn't just about restoring my home or my voice. It was about understanding the power of my own presence in the world, even after betrayal. Daniel, too, began showing signs of genuine change. He started volunteering small acts of service without my prompting, not to assert dominance, but to contribute in meaningful ways. He brought groceries when I was unwell, helped with heavier household repairs, and even began asking about family history, eager to connect through shared memory rather than control. I could see him struggling, still learning, but making conscious choices to act differently. One evening, he came in carrying an old photo album, dusty and forgotten, retrieved from the attic. "I thought you might want to see these," he said, placing it carefully on the coffee table. I opened it slowly, tracing the edges of photographs with my fingers. Pictures of Daniel as a baby, first birthdays, family vacations, and moments of pure joy. I smiled softly, feeling the weight of nostalgia and gratitude. This was a bridge to the past, a reminder that our relationship wasn't solely defined by the betrayal, but also by decades of love, care, and shared memories. "Daniel, Mom," he said quietly, "I never want to hurt you again. I want to understand what it means to care properly." I studied his face. There was sincerity there, tempered by the lessons of the courtroom. "Then start by listening," I said gently. "Start by respecting what I need, not what you think I need. Care isn't ownership, and love isn't control. Remember that." He nodded solemnly, and in that moment, I felt a shift. Not dramatic, not instantaneous, but real. Small seeds of understanding had been planted, much like the marigolds and tomatoes we had tended together weeks before. With time, patience, and effort, they could grow into something resilient, just as our relationship could. Over the next several months, I continued to reclaim my life. I joined a local book club, began taking short walks in the neighborhood, and even enrolled in a painting class at the community center. Each activity reminded me that life is meant to be lived fully, that independence is a gift to be cherished, and that fear, while natural, cannot dominate when faced with awareness and action. Daniel remained part of my life, cautiously, respectfully, and in ways that honored both of our boundaries. He brought meals occasionally, shared small tasks, and engaged in long conversations about memories, family history, and future plans. I didn't forget the betrayal, but I also recognized that redemption is possible when accountability and humility are present. One evening, after a particularly long day of gardening, we sat together on the porch, sipping lemonade and watching the sunset. The sky was painted in shades of orange and pink, the kind of colors that make you feel alive even in the quietest moments. Daniel turned to me and said, "I never realized how important it is to listen, to really hear someone. I see now that love isn't about control, it's about presence." I smiled at him, feeling a deep sense of relief. "That's a lesson worth learning, Daniel," I said softly, "and it's never too late to start." The house felt warmer that evening, not just because of the setting sun, but because the space between us had begun to heal. The walls, the floorboards, and even the air seemed to hold memories of past struggles, but also the quiet possibility of reconciliation. Life had not returned to how it was before the guardianship attempt. It never could. But it had found a new equilibrium, one built on respect, honesty, and the careful cultivation of trust. I went to bed that night with a sense of calm I hadn't felt in months. Betrayal came from the hands I once held, but it had not broken me. The courtroom, the judge's question, the fear and the tension all taught me something invaluable. Independence is maintained through vigilance, dignity is preserved through assertion, and relationships, even strained ones, can find new paths if honesty and respect are present. As I drifted off to sleep, I realized that life, with all its trials, is not about avoiding hurt, but about learning how to stand tall in the face of it. It's about reclaiming what belongs to you, your voice, your home, your memory, your spirit, and ensuring that no one can take it without your consent. And in that quiet, steady understanding, I felt the true weight of resilience, not loud or dramatic, but undeniable, unyielding, and entirely my own. The following spring brought with it a subtle renewal, both outside my house and within my life. The garden bloomed brighter than it had in years, the scent of marigolds and jasmine drifting through open windows. The birds returned to the feeders I'd set out months before, their chirping a gentle reminder that life continued and that joy often emerges quietly after a storm. I moved through the house with a calmness I hadn't known in a long time, savoring each small detail, the warmth of sunlight on the hardwood floors, the familiar creak of the staircase, the echo of my own laughter. Daniel was visiting more frequently, though always with careful intention. He no longer barged in, no longer assumed knowledge or authority. Each interaction was deliberate, measured, an exercise in rebuilding what had been broken. He helped around the house, yes, but he did so when asked, not when he deemed necessary. He listened when I spoke, and he waited for my guidance. I could see the tension in him slowly ease, replaced by a cautious humility. One morning as I watered the garden, he approached with a small tray of breakfast, toast, fruit, and coffee. He said quietly, "I thought we could eat outside." There was no smugness in his tone, no expectation, just a simple act of service offered with care. We sat on the porch, the sun warming our faces, and ate in comfortable silence. The wind rustled through the trees, carrying with it the faint scent of blooming flowers. Daniel broke the quiet first. "Mom," he began hesitantly, "I've been thinking about what the judge said that day, about responsibility and capacity. I think I understand now how much I underestimated you." I looked at him, studying his expression. It was earnest, tinged with shame, but also with a genuine desire to acknowledge the truth. "Daniel," I said softly, "it wasn't just the judge's question that mattered. It was what you chose to do afterward that counts. Recognizing a mistake is one thing. Changing how you act is another. You're learning both, and that's important." He nodded slowly, as if absorbing every word. "I want to do better," he said quietly, "not just for me, but for us." The words carried weight, but I knew that change is never instantaneous. Trust, once fractured, takes time and patience to rebuild. Still, I allowed myself to hope, cautiously, that the bond between us could heal, albeit differently than it had been. In the weeks that followed, our relationship settled into a rhythm that was unfamiliar but comforting. Daniel no longer tried to control or assert power. He asked, he listened, and he offered support when appropriate. Together, we repaired parts of the house that had been neglected: the cracked windows, the worn deck boards, the leaky gutters. These acts were practical, yes, but they were also symbolic, a quiet rebuilding of trust, brick by brick, board by board. I also began to reach out more to friends and neighbors, attending small gatherings, volunteering at the community center, and sharing my story with other seniors who had experienced betrayal. each conversation reinforced my sense of autonomy, my understanding that life continues even after betrayal, and that strength is built not only in confrontation, but in the courage to reclaim one's narrative. One day, as Daniel and I were sorting through old boxes in the attic, we stumbled upon a collection of letters between my husband and me. The handwriting was familiar, flowing and deliberate, a reflection of a life lived fully and deliberately. I ran my fingers over the paper, feeling the texture, the weight of history. "These are treasures," I whispered. Daniel nodded, his eyes soft. "I didn't realize how much history we almost lost," he said. "I see now how preserving your life and choices was never about inconvenience or fear. It was about respect." I smiled faintly. "Exactly, and that's a lesson that will stay with you, I hope, long after you leave this house." We spent the afternoon reading through the letters, laughing at memories long forgotten, and quietly reflecting on the years that had shaped us. There was no anger, no recrimination, only acknowledgement and a slow, tentative reconnection. It was fragile, yes, but it was real. Later that evening, I reflected on the courtroom again, on the single question the judge had asked that revealed the truth. It was such a simple question, yet it carried the power to undo years of manipulation. I realized then that clarity and observation are often more powerful than confrontation. Sometimes one well-placed question is all it takes to reveal the truth, and that truth, once visible, cannot be denied. Daniel began to show more initiative in understanding boundaries, not to assert authority, but to strengthen our connection. He asked thoughtful questions about my daily life, about my preferences, and about what made me feel respected. I guided him patiently, explaining not only what I needed, but why. Each explanation was a lesson, not a lecture, and each action he took afterward was a demonstration of understanding. One afternoon, he came to me with a small stack of old family photographs. He said, "I thought you might like to see these. They're memories we almost lost." I took them carefully, feeling the weight of the past. These photos were more than pictures. They were proof of a life that had existed before betrayal, evidence of love and connection that could never be erased. I smiled faintly, placing them on the mantel alongside the framed wedding photo of my husband and me. As the weeks turned into months, I noticed subtle changes in Daniel. He was quieter, more reflective, and more attuned to the feelings of others. He no longer spoke in the confident, rehearsed tone that had dominated the courtroom. Instead, he spoke thoughtfully, choosing words carefully, considering the impact of his actions. It was not perfection, but it was growth, a sign that even after mistakes, transformation is possible. I, too, continued to grow. The experience taught me resilience, vigilance, and the importance of asserting boundaries. I joined a local senior group, participated in community activities, and even took up painting again. Each action reinforced my sense of agency, my understanding that life continues, and that betrayal, while painful, does not define us unless we allow it to be. One evening, Daniel and I sat on the porch watching the sun set over the garden. The sky was a tapestry of orange and pink, the air filled with the scent of blooming flowers. We didn't speak for a long time, simply sitting together in comfortable silence, sharing the presence that was once strained by mistrust and fear. Finally, he spoke. "Mom," he said quietly, "I want to thank you for patience, for guidance, and for showing me what true care really means." I turned to him, seeing the sincerity in his eyes. "Daniel, the lesson is mutual. You've learned humility, and I've learned the value of boundaries. Together, we've both grown." It wasn't a perfect resolution, relationships never are, but it was real. It was honest, and in the quiet of that evening, I realized that life after betrayal can still hold moments of peace, understanding, and connection if we are willing to navigate the delicate balance between caution and forgiveness. That night, I went to bed feeling a quiet strength. The house was mine, my voice was mine, and my life, though scarred by betrayal, was intact. I had faced the challenge, stood firm, and emerged with a renewed sense of agency and resilience. Daniel was learning, I was healing, and the future, uncertain but promising, stretched out before us. In the weeks that followed, our interactions became more natural. We laughed together, shared memories, and even planned small family gatherings. The ghosts of the courtroom lingered, yes, but they no longer haunted me. Instead, they served as reminders of the lessons learned. Independence is precious, dignity must be defended, and relationships, though fragile, can be repaired with effort, honesty, and respect. Through it all, I understood one crucial truth. Betrayal does not have to define us. It does not have to consume our lives or diminish our worth. What defines us is how we respond, how we reclaim our voice, our space, and our dignity. And as I looked at Daniel, finally learning to navigate care without control, I felt a cautious optimism that even after the deepest wounds, understanding and connection are possible. The summer that followed was, in many ways, a season of small reconciliations and quiet victories. The garden bloomed fully, a riot of color that seemed almost symbolic, a living reminder that life could flourish even after hardship. I spent hours tending to it, pulling weeds, pruning branches, and planting new flowers in places I had neglected for years. Daniel helped when asked, carrying heavy pots or digging small holes, but never assuming, never directing. There was a rhythm to it now, an unspoken understanding that this was my space, my home, and my life, and that he could participate but never dominate. One afternoon, Daniel brought over a stack of old family albums he had discovered in the attic. "I thought you'd like to see these," he said, setting them gently on the kitchen table. I felt a pang of nostalgia as I flipped through the pages, photographs of my husband and me on our wedding day, Daniel as a toddler with his first bicycle, birthdays, holidays, moments frozen in time. The images reminded me that life was full of love, laughter, and ordinary beauty, even if it had been threatened by betrayal. We spent hours going through the albums together, laughing quietly at memories long forgotten, and occasionally falling silent in contemplation. There was no resentment between us in those moments, only the fragile rebuilding of trust. Daniel had begun to understand that his previous actions had not just endangered my home, but my sense of agency, my ability to make decisions about my own life. He was learning, slowly, that true care doesn't come from control, but from listening, respecting, and supporting. Evenings became a time for reflection. I would sit by the window, journaling about the day, writing down thoughts, feelings, and observations. The act of putting words on paper helped me process the lingering anxiety from the guardianship attempt. I wrote about Daniel's growth, the lessons I had learned, and the strength I had discovered in defending my independence. Writing had become a form of affirmation, a way to solidify my voice in a world that had tried to take it from me. Daniel, too, was changing. He had begun volunteering small acts of care without prompting or expectation. He would bring groceries when I mentioned I was low, help with household repairs I requested, and even occasionally surprise me with freshly baked bread or flowers from the garden. These gestures were not grand or dramatic, but they were meaningful. They reflected his growing understanding of the difference between love and control, care and domination. One evening, he approached me hesitantly, holding a faded leather-bound journal. "I found this in the attic," he said quietly. "It belonged to Dad. I thought you might want it." I took the journal from him carefully, feeling the weight of history in my hands. Inside were notes, reflections, and letters from my husband, observations about daily life, anecdotes about Daniel as a child, and reminders of the love and care that had defined our family before betrayal had intruded. Each page carried a sense of connection, a thread linking past and present, reminding me of what had always been mine. "Thank you, Daniel," I said softly. "These are precious, not just because of what they contain, but because they remind us of the life we've lived and the love that still exists." He nodded, his eyes downcast. "I never wanted to erase any of this," he said quietly. I didn't know how to handle it. I was afraid of losing you." I looked at him, feeling a mixture of sadness and empathy. "Fear doesn't give anyone the right to take from others," I said gently, "but acknowledgement, understanding, and respect, those do. That's how we move forward." Over time, Daniel's visits became more relaxed. We would sit together on the porch, watching the sunset, or in the kitchen, talking quietly as I prepared dinner. We shared memories, discussed small household projects, and occasionally laughed at our past mistakes. The tension that had dominated our relationship for so long began to ease, replaced with cautious warmth. Despite the slow restoration of our bond, I remained vigilant. Trust, once broken, must be rebuilt with consistent effort and awareness. I continued to document important transactions, keep copies of critical documents, and maintain oversight of my financial affairs. These measures were not acts of mistrust, but acts of self-preservation. Independence is fragile when others try to seize it, and I had learned firsthand the importance of vigilance. One evening, Daniel surprised me with a small wooden bench for the garden. He said, "I thought this would be nice. You could sit here and watch the flowers." I smiled, touched by the gesture. It was simple, unassuming, and thoughtful, a reflection of care without control. I placed it near the rose bushes, a sunny spot where the light fell perfectly in the late afternoon. Sitting there that evening, I felt a deep sense of peace. The garden had become a sanctuary, a place where I could reflect on the past, embrace the present, and plan for the future. As the summer progressed, our conversations began to deepen. Daniel asked about my experiences, my fears, and my perspectives on life. I shared openly, not just about the guardianship attempt, but about the lessons I had learned from it, the importance of autonomy, the power of calm observation, and the necessity of boundaries. He listened intently, absorbing the lessons with a seriousness that surprised me. One afternoon, as we were repairing the old fence along the property line, he turned to me. "Mom," he said quietly, "I want to make sure I never make the same mistakes again. I want to understand what true care really means." I paused, considering my response. "True care," I said, "is not about possession or control. It is about presence, support, and respect. It is about allowing someone to live their life while offering help when it is needed, not when it is convenient or desired. Care is guidance without domination. It is love that respects boundaries." He nodded thoughtfully. "I think I understand now, and I will do my best to remember it." That evening, as the sun set behind the trees, I reflected on how far we had come. The journey had been difficult, marked by betrayal, fear, and mistrust, but it had also been a journey of growth, reflection, and learning for both of us. Daniel had begun to understand the consequences of his actions, and I had reclaimed my independence, my voice, and my sense of agency. I also began to reconnect with the broader community. I joined a local senior center, participated in volunteer activities, and shared my experiences with others who had faced similar challenges. These interactions reinforced my sense of resilience and reminded me that life continues even after betrayal. Strength is not only about surviving adversity, but about using that experience to guide and support others. Daniel, too, grew through these experiences. He began to recognize that his desire to control was rooted in fear and that true love requires trust and respect. Our interactions, while still cautious, became more genuine, marked by shared effort, mutual understanding, and slowly rebuilding trust. One evening, as we sat together on the porch, he handed me a small photograph. It was of our family, taken many years ago, a moment of happiness and togetherness. He said, "I thought you might want this." I took the photograph and placed it on the mantel alongside other memories. It was more than a picture. It was a reminder of what we had lost, what we had survived, and what we could still nurture together. As I went to bed that night, the house quiet and the summer breeze drifting through the windows, I felt a deep sense of peace. The guardianship attempt, the courtroom, and the betrayal had all left scars, yes, but they had also revealed strength I didn't fully recognize in myself. My life, my home, and my voice were intact, and in that I discovered a victory far greater than any legal ruling could ever provide. Autumn arrived quietly, painting the neighborhood in warm shades of amber, gold, and crimson. The garden, once full and riotous with summer blooms, had started to slow, leaves turning brittle and the first chill of the season creeping in. I moved through the house with a sense of calm vigilance, checking windows, making sure heating systems were ready, and tending to small repairs that had been neglected. The rhythm of daily life felt peaceful, even purposeful. I had reclaimed my routines, my independence, and, most importantly, my sense of control over my own life. Daniel's visits had become consistent but gentle, marked by awareness and respect. He no longer hovered, no longer questioned my judgment, and never assumed authority over decisions that belonged to me. I could see the subtle transformation in him, less arrogance, more thoughtfulness, more patience. Watching him interact with the home, the garden, and with me was like observing a student learning lessons they had initially resisted. He was learning accountability, respect, and the true meaning of care. One Sunday morning, he arrived with a small wooden crate. He said softly, "I found these in the basement," he said. "They belong to Dad. I thought we could look through them together." Inside were journals, letters, and photographs spanning decades, memories I had long forgotten, some I hadn't realized had survived. I ran my fingers over the worn pages, feeling the faint impression of my husband's handwriting, the careful curves and loops that had once chronicled our shared life. There were letters between my husband and me, notes Daniel had written as a child, and photographs that captured moments of ordinary joy and love. Each item was a reminder of history, of continuity, and of resilience. "Thank you," I whispered, my voice tight with emotion. "These are precious, not because of what they are, but because they remind me that life, love, and family existed before fear and betrayal ever entered the picture." Daniel nodded, his expression subdued. "I never wanted to erase any of this," he said quietly. I didn't know how to handle it. I was afraid of losing you, Mom." I looked at him, weighing my response. "Fear doesn't give anyone the right to take from others, Daniel. But understanding, acknowledgement, and respect, that does. That's the difference between care and control." He absorbed my words silently, the weight of realization settling over him. I saw the tension in his shoulders, the subtle falter in his posture, the vulnerability of someone who had learned a harsh lesson. It was not humility born of defeat alone, but of awareness of the consequences of actions and the recognition of the dignity of another person. The afternoon drifted on as we sifted through the papers, sharing stories, laughing quietly, and occasionally falling silent in contemplation. Each letter, photograph, and journal entry became a bridge, connecting the present with a past that had almost been erased, linking the son I had raised with the man he was striving to become. Over the following weeks, our interactions grew more natural. Daniel no longer operated from fear, control, or expectation. He helped with small household repairs, accompanied me on errands when I asked, and even contributed to cooking meals, not to assert authority or prove usefulness, but simply to participate. I noticed the difference in him, a quiet attentiveness, a careful listening, and a slow, deliberate effort to respect boundaries. At night, I reflected on the journey that had brought us here. The courtroom, the guardianship attempt, and the judge's single piercing question had been defining moments. They revealed both the fragility of trust and the resilience of agency. That question, so simple and human, had exposed Daniel's intentions and reminded me that vigilance, clarity, and self-assertion are as important as courage. It had reinforced the lesson that strength is not always loud or dramatic. It is measured, steady, and deeply rooted. I also recognized the subtle changes in myself. I was no longer consumed by fear or paranoia. I moved with awareness, yes, but I had regained confidence. I had learned that independence is preserved through assertiveness, self-respect, and the consistent practice of vigilance. I had reclaimed my voice, my space, and my sense of self, not through confrontation alone, but through careful observation, patience, and the cultivation of boundaries. One chilly evening, Daniel brought out a small wooden frame, weathered but polished. Inside was a photograph of my husband and me taken many years ago on a summer evening, smiling at each other under the warm sun. He said softly, "I thought you might like this." I accepted it with care, placing it on the mantel alongside other treasured memories. It was a simple act, but it spoke volumes. It was acknowledgement, respect, and the desire to preserve what was important, not just for me, but for him as well. Small gestures like this carried more weight than words ever could. In the days that followed, our routine continued to strengthen the subtle bonds of trust. We repaired the roof together, worked in the garden, and sorted through old mementos. Daniel had learned to ask before acting, to listen carefully, and to recognize the consequences of past actions. I, in turn, had learned to accept small gestures of care without expecting perfection or harboring resentment. I also reconnected with friends and neighbors, attending gatherings and sharing my story of resilience. Each conversation reinforced the understanding that life continues, that betrayal does not define us, and the ability to assert our dignity is a lesson worth sharing. I discovered that my experiences could help others navigate their own challenges, and that teaching through lived example is a form of strength often overlooked. One afternoon, as the autumn leaves swirled outside the window, Daniel asked a difficult question. "Mom," he began hesitantly, "how do you forgive? How do you move past something like what I did?" I considered my response carefully. Forgiveness, I realized, wasn't about erasing the past. It wasn't about forgetting or pretending harm had not occurred. It was about acknowledging the truth, understanding the lesson, and choosing how to move forward without letting bitterness control your life. Forgiveness, I said slowly, isn't about absolving the wrong. It's about reclaiming your own peace. You forgive so that you can move forward, not so that the other person is excused. It's about recognizing the lessons, asserting boundaries, and finding the strength to continue living fully. Daniel absorbed my words silently, the weight of realization settling over him. I saw the tension in his shoulders, the subtle falter in his posture, the vulnerability of someone who had learned a harsh lesson. It was not humility born of defeat alone, but of awareness of the consequences of actions, and the recognition of the dignity of another person. The days grew shorter, the nights cooler, and the house settled into a steady rhythm. Daniel continued to visit and assist, always with awareness and respect. I maintained vigilance over my affairs, ensuring that my independence remained intact. And in that careful balance, I discovered a profound truth. Life after betrayal is not about returning to the way things were. It is about moving forward with awareness, patience, and courage. One evening, as we sat on the porch watching the sun dip below the horizon, Daniel turned to me. "Mom," he said softly, "I never want to hurt you again. I want to understand how to care properly without overstepping." I studied him, seeing the sincerity etched on his face. "Then start by listening," I said gently. "Start by respecting what I need, not what you think I need. Care isn't ownership. Love isn't control. And remember, boundaries are the most important form of care." He nodded solemnly, a subtle but meaningful acknowledgement. The road ahead was long, but the foundation had been laid. The tension, fear, and betrayal had not vanished entirely, but they had been transformed into lessons, awareness, and cautious hope. That evening, as I lay in bed, I reflected on the journey so far. The betrayal, the courtroom, the judge's decisive question, and the slow reconstruction of trust with my son. I realized that life's challenges, even when painful, often reveal hidden reservoirs of strength. Independence, dignity, and self-respect are defended not only in moments of confrontation, but also in the quiet assertion of boundaries, vigilance, and the cultivation of relationships. I closed my eyes, feeling a sense of quiet triumph. The guardianship attempt had threatened my life, my home, and my agency, but it had also illuminated my resilience. I had stood firm, reclaimed my voice, and taught my son the true meaning of care. And though the road to full reconciliation would be long and uncertain, I felt a tentative hope that even after betrayal, understanding, growth, and connection are possible. Winter came gently that year, dusting the neighborhood with frost and silvery mornings that made the world feel quiet and still. The garden lay dormant, leaves crisp underfoot, but inside the house, life hummed with a steady rhythm. The warmth of the fireplace, the familiar creak of the floorboards, and the aroma of my herbal tea brewing in the kitchen reminded me every day that this was my home, my sanctuary, and my life. The months since the courtroom ordeal had changed everything, yet in some ways they had strengthened me more than I could have imagined. Daniel's visits continued with steady consistency, now part of the rhythm of daily life rather than something forced by circumstance. His approach had shifted completely. Gone was the rehearsed confidence, the assumption of authority, the attempt to control. In its place, there was attentiveness, patience, and an earnest desire to act in alignment with my needs rather than his ambitions. He still made mistakes, still stumbled at times, but the difference was that he now recognized the consequences of his missteps and sought to correct them. One morning, he arrived carrying a basket of firewood. "Thought we could stack these by the fireplace," he said, smiling faintly. It was a small gesture, but I recognized the significance. He had learned that care is expressed in acts of service without expectation of dominance or reward. It was a lesson I had hoped he would understand, and seeing it in action filled me with cautious pride. We worked together in the crisp morning air, stacking logs carefully by the hearth. There was a silence at first, comfortable and unhurried, the kind of quiet that speaks more than words ever could. Occasionally, Daniel would glance at me and ask questions, not about what I should do, but about what I preferred, how I felt, and what I needed. Each question, each act, was a reminder that the lessons of the courtroom had not been in vain. After we finished stacking the wood, I handed him a warm cup of tea. "You're learning well," I said softly, "not just about helping, but about understanding boundaries. That is the true test of care." He nodded, eyes downcast, as if the acknowledgement alone carried weight. "I know I failed before," he admitted quietly, "but I want to do better. I want to care without hurting." The words carried a sincerity that made my chest ache with a mixture of relief and lingering sadness. The son who had once tried to seize my home had begun to understand the boundaries of love, care, and respect. It would take time, but the foundations were set. Winter evenings became a period of reflection. I spent time journaling, revisiting old letters, and even rereading the journals my husband had left behind. I found comfort in writing, in documenting my thoughts, my emotions, and the lessons learned from betrayal. Each word reinforced my agency, reminded me of my voice, and allowed me to process the emotional labyrinth I had navigated over the past year. Daniel, too, engaged in these quiet moments of reflection. Occasionally, he would sit with me, leafing through journals or photographs, asking questions about past experiences, family stories, and my perspective on life. He was learning patience, humility, and the slow, deliberate process of understanding. These conversations were not easy. They carried echoes of the courtroom, of fear, and of mistakes, but they were genuine. They were the careful building blocks of trust. One day, he brought out a small envelope, yellowed and fragile with age. "I found this tucked behind some books," he said softly. "It's addressed to you, from Dad." I took the envelope with trembling hands, breaking the seal carefully. Inside was a letter from my husband, written decades earlier, full of wisdom, love, and reminders about resilience and integrity. The words seemed almost prophetic now, speaking directly to the challenges I had faced and the strength I had discovered within myself. "I thought you might want to keep it safe," Daniel said quietly, standing nearby with a tentative posture. I folded the letter, holding it close, feeling the weight of the past and the presence of those I loved. "Thank you," I said softly. "This isn't just a letter. It's a reminder of the life we've built, the lessons we've learned, and the strength that has carried me through. It's proof that love and wisdom endure, even in difficult times." Daniel nodded, a quiet understanding settling over him. He was beginning to grasp that care is not about possession, but about presence. It is not about control, but about respect. The lessons of the courtroom had etched themselves into his consciousness, and the path of humility and understanding was becoming clearer with each passing day. In the following weeks, life continued its steady rhythm. Daniel and I worked together to prepare the home for winter, clearing gutters, sealing windows, and ensuring that the heating system was functioning properly. Each task was practical, yet it also symbolized a deeper reality. We were learning to cooperate without dominance, to share space without conflict, and to rebuild trust step by step. I also began reconnecting with my community in earnest. I attended book clubs, volunteered at the local senior center, and shared my experiences with others who had faced similar challenges. Each conversation reinforced the understanding that betrayal does not define us, and that reclaiming agency, dignity, and voice is possible with vigilance, reflection, and assertiveness. The sense of empowerment I felt was not born of victory alone, but of conscious reclamation of self, and it radiated into every corner of my life. One evening, Daniel approached me with a small framed photograph of our family taken many years ago. "He thought this belonged here," he said quietly, "where it can be seen, remembered." I accepted it with care, placing it alongside other cherished memories on the mantel. The photograph represented continuity, resilience, and the enduring presence of love even after moments of fear and betrayal. It was a quiet affirmation that life, despite its hardships, carries the potential for healing, reflection, and growth. As winter deepened, our conversations grew richer, more thoughtful. Daniel began asking questions about morality, responsibility, and the consequences of actions, not just his own, but those of people around him. It was as if the courtroom lessons had unlocked a new awareness, a perspective that extended beyond our personal relationship. One evening, he asked a question that lingered with me long after the words were spoken. "Mom, how do you know when someone truly understands care?" I paused, considering my response. You know when their actions match their words, when they ask before acting, when they listen before speaking, and when they respect boundaries without being reminded. Care is consistent, thoughtful, and aware. It doesn't demand, manipulate, or dominate. True understanding is proven in the small, everyday choices, not grand gestures alone. Daniel absorbed this quietly, a solemn nod acknowledging the lesson. He seemed to understand that true care requires effort, humility, and awareness, qualities he had only begun to practice. The path ahead would not be perfect, but the foundation was firmly laid. Over the next several months, I continued to nurture both the home and my relationship with Daniel. I maintained vigilance over financial and legal matters, ensuring that my independence remained secure. I pursued hobbies, reconnected with friends, and fully embraced my agency. Daniel, for his part, continued to demonstrate growth. He engaged in thoughtful acts of service, listened carefully, and showed consistent respect for my autonomy. Our relationship, while not without its complexities, had evolved into one marked by cautious trust, understanding, and a shared commitment to care without control. One snowy evening, as the first flakes of winter fell outside, Daniel brought in a cup of tea and sat quietly beside me. We watched the snowfall together, the world outside transformed into a quiet white canvas. The peace of the moment was a testament to the resilience we had both cultivated, a quiet victory over fear, betrayal, and misunderstanding. He turned to me and said softly, "Mom, I don't know if I'll ever fully make up for what I tried to do, but I want to keep learning. I want to do better. I want to be someone you can trust." I looked at him, seeing the sincerity etched across his face. "Daniel," I said gently, "trust is earned, not assumed, and you've begun that process. Keep listening, keep respecting, and keep acting with awareness. That is how care becomes real, and that is how trust is rebuilt." As I lay in bed later that night, the house quiet and the snow settling around it, I reflected on the journey we had taken. Betrayal had come from the hands I had once held with love, but it had not destroyed me. The courtroom, the judge's question, the fear and tension had all revealed a truth. Independence, dignity, and voice must be protected, asserted, and preserved. I also realized that relationships can endure even after betrayal when accountability, humility, and awareness are present. Daniel had learned, slowly and imperfectly, but genuinely. Our bond was no longer the same as before. It was stronger in some ways, tempered by honesty and careful attention, and in that I found hope. Spring returned the following year, bringing with it the promise of renewal. The garden, now carefully tended, was filled with bright blooms, the scent of jasmine and roses drifting through open windows. The birds had returned, filling the air with their soft, melodic songs. Life had a quiet rhythm again, one of ordinary beauty, small victories, and the reassurance that the home I had fought to protect was truly mine. Daniel's visits had settled into a natural cadence. He arrived not out of obligation or guilt, but from a genuine desire to share moments of life with me. He helped when asked, listened attentively, and no longer made assumptions about what he thought was best. I had observed this gradual shift with cautious optimism. The son who had once filed for guardianship to take my home had begun to understand, in a tangible, human way, the meaning of respect, care, and accountability. One morning, he knocked on my door softly, holding a small wooden box. He said, "I thought we could go through this together." Inside were letters and photographs from my husband, preserved for decades. Each item carried memories of love, laughter, and ordinary life before the shadow of betrayal had appeared. I felt the weight of time and history in my hands, the echo of decades, the presence of those no longer here, and the life we had all shared. As we sorted through the contents, Daniel listened intently to my stories, asking questions about moments he had never remembered, lessons learned, and the values my husband had instilled in both of us. I spoke openly, describing not only the joy but also the pain, the guardianship attempt, the courtroom, the fear, and the betrayal. I told him how I had reclaimed my voice, my autonomy, and my dignity, emphasizing the importance of boundaries and the responsibility that comes with love. He absorbed every word, often quietly, sometimes nodding, sometimes pausing to reflect. It was clear that the experience had left a permanent imprint on him. He had begun to understand deeply the consequences of his past actions, and more importantly, the way to move forward with humility, awareness, and respect. The house felt different now, alive in a way it hadn't been for months. Each corner, each room carried memories not just of the past, but of survival, resilience, and the careful reclamation of life. I could walk through the halls with a sense of ownership, not just of the property, but of my story, my voice, and my power to make choices about my own life. One afternoon, as the sun slanted through the windows, Daniel brought over an old, worn photograph of my husband, me, and Daniel as a child, taken on a long-ago vacation. He handed it to me with careful reverence. He said, "I thought it should be here, where it belongs." I smiled, touched by the gesture. The photograph represented continuity, love, and resilience, a tangible proof that life and connection endure even after moments of fear and betrayal. It was not a dramatic reconciliation, not an instant erasure of past mistakes, but a quiet, deliberate act of acknowledgement and care. Winter had taught me vigilance, patience, and the importance of boundaries. Spring was teaching me renewal, hope, and the quiet power of persistence. I realized then that life is a series of seasons, each bringing lessons, challenges, and opportunities for growth. The guardianship attempt had been one of the harshest winters I had faced, but I had emerged with my voice intact, my home secure, and my dignity preserved. Daniel, too, was changing. He had begun to internalize the lessons of respect, care, and humility. He asked before acting, he listened attentively, and he performed acts of service without expectation. He had learned that love is not about control, and care is not measured by authority, but by presence and awareness. Slowly, imperfectly, he was becoming someone I could trust. One evening, as we sat on the porch watching the sunset, Daniel spoke again. "Mom," he said quietly, "I never want to hurt you again. I want to be someone who understands what care really means." I studied him, seeing the earnestness in his eyes, and I felt a cautious relief. "Then start by acting, not just speaking," I said gently. "Listen before deciding, respect boundaries, offer support without controlling. That is how trust is built, and care becomes genuine." He nodded solemnly, the weight of the lesson settling over him. I realized then that reconciliation is rarely instant or perfect. It is gradual, deliberate, and requires constant attention. The courtroom, the judge's question, and the months of vigilance had taught me the power of observation, the strength in calm assertion, and the quiet impact of one well-timed, piercing question. Daniel had learned these lessons too, albeit in his own time and in his own way. In the following months, our lives found a steady rhythm. Daniel helped with seasonal chores, accompanied me on errands, and participated in small household projects. We shared quiet dinners, conversations about family history, and moments of laughter over memories rediscovered. Our relationship was not perfect, but it was real, grounded in honesty, accountability, and the shared acknowledgement of mistakes and growth. I also reconnected with the broader community, sharing my experiences with others who had faced similar challenges. My story of betrayal, vigilance, and recovery became a quiet form of advocacy, a reminder that independence, dignity, and self-respect are worth defending, and that even after the deepest wounds, growth and healing are possible. One afternoon, Daniel and I planted a small memorial rose bush in the garden for honor of my husband. He said, "I want to help preserve these memories." He placed the plant carefully in the soil. I watched him work, noting the attentiveness and care in his movements. It was not an act of dominance or possession, but of respect and remembrance. The gesture spoke volumes about the growth he had achieved and the lessons he had absorbed. Life, I realized, is not defined by betrayal alone, but how we respond to it. Independence is preserved through vigilance, dignity through assertiveness, and relationships through patience, respect, and consistent care. Daniel had begun to understand this, and I had learned to trust the slow, deliberate process of growth. Together, we were creating a new dynamic, one of cautious optimism, mutual respect, and genuine care. Even as the seasons continued to turn, I carried the lessons of the courtroom with me. One question had changed everything. One moment of clarity had exposed deception and reaffirmed my autonomy. It was a reminder that vigilance, calm observation, and measured action are often more powerful than confrontation alone. The lesson extended beyond my relationship with Daniel. It was a truth about life, resilience, and the preservation of dignity. As spring deepened, the house, the garden, and our lives felt renewed. Daniel's visits had become less about obligation and more about shared experiences. He offered support without expectation, listened without judgment, and acted with genuine respect. The bond we had rebuilt was fragile but real, grounded in lessons learned and the mutual desire to honor one another's dignity. One evening, I found myself sitting by the window, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and pink. Daniel sat nearby, quietly reading, occasionally looking up to smile or comment on a memory we had shared. I felt a deep sense of gratitude for the house I had protected, for the life I had reclaimed, and for the cautious but genuine reconciliation with my son. I realized then that life after betrayal is not about erasing pain or pretending it never happened. It is about reclaiming what belongs to us, our voice, our agency, our dignity, and teaching others, when possible, the difference between care and control. It is about observing, acting, and asserting boundaries while allowing room for growth, understanding, and cautious trust. Daniel, once a source of fear and betrayal, had become a reflection of that possibility. He had stumbled, he had erred, but he had begun to understand. He had learned humility, respect, and the quiet power of presence. And I had learned once again that life's trials do not define us. How we respond to them does. That night, as I prepared for bed, I felt a profound sense of closure. The guardianship attempt, the courtroom, and the months of fear and vigilance had been transformative. I had reclaimed my home, my voice, and my independence. I had helped my son begin the journey towards understanding, respect, and genuine care. And I had discovered in the quiet moments of reflection and the slow restoration of trust that life, even after betrayal, can be full of hope, resilience, and renewal. I breathed deeply, feeling the steady pulse of life around me, the house, the garden, the memories, and the tentative hope in my son's eyes. I had endured betrayal, reclaimed my home, and emerged with a renewed sense of agency. The story of pain had become a story of strength, and in that quiet, steadfast understanding, I felt the profound weight of resilience, autonomy, and love, lessons that would endure for the rest of my days.